Hi everyone, welcome to our first remote lecture where we'll be making up the topic of posthumanism and transhumanism from last week. I received a number of good reading responses from you where you really intuited Wolf's text in a pretty commendable way. It's a very, very difficult text, a lot of sort of theoretical presuppositions that you need to know about, sort of a literature he presumes you might know about already, but many of you did a really good job. So what we'll do with these remote lectures, again, this is the first one, so let's see how it goes. I'll probably try to keep it somewhat shorter, but what we'll do is I'm gonna go over the PowerPoint the way I would in class, give you the major points, and not so much for this one because it's just a makeup. But for the subsequent lectures, I will ask you questions. I will ask you to sort of have your email up next to you while you're watching this, so that you'll be able to email me and answer some questions or do some further thinking as you're going through these lectures, so that when you're done with the lecture, you'll email me with those answers or further thinking, and that'll be your attendance for that day. And the administration is pretty clear, they're pretty adamant that we have to have some sort of record week to week of attendance to make sure that we're keeping up with the work that we had planned remotely from our homes. So if you do that, along with your reading responses, it'll be golden. We'll be good, and we'll make do. And so before even getting into the topic, I just hope everybody's doing okay. It's kind of a crazy time right now. I hope you're all doing well. If you need anything that pertains to the class, extra time because of job situation, home situation, always feel free to email me, and I'll work with you. So I'm here from home. My cat might bother us at some point. He's always jealous when I talk into electronic devices, like when I'm on the phone. So I might have to pause it, but let's see how it goes. So posthumanism, transhumanism. So the first thing we'd want to talk about and say is, well, what is the human? What is humanity as a category? This is something we haven't really talked about in class, because we've been talking so much about what is an animal, from mythology all the way up to animal rights, to zoopolis. The preoccupation was on the animal, and we sort of assumed that we knew what the human was, that humanity is a stable thing, that it's given to us, right? We have it. But there is a sense in which the human is actually a historical category. You might want to call it like a formation of knowledge throughout history, right? It's not, let's say, something that just comes up a tree. That was just given to us, right? So the human is an evolutionary figure. We've evolved. But on top of that evolution, we have technology, we have culture, we have history, we have all these things that sort of make up concepts, that make up how we understand the world and ourselves, right? That's history and culture in the broadest sense, knowledge, philosophy, art, what have you. And so the question to ask is, how and in what way has the human been formed? In what way is the human a historical category? So in that passage in the Wolf reading where he talks about Foucault and this very famous line in The Order of Things of man being a recent invention, and it might be an invention that ends at some point like a face in the sea, in the sand at the edge of the sea. The point there, in like really poetic terms, Foucault's point there is to say that man, humanity, the human, is actually a modern construct. And there have been other versions of the human. Let's say what it means to be a human or alive in ancient Greece is different than what it means to be human in the Middle Ages, or what it means to be human in the modern West or in the contemporary period, let alone, let's say, in non-Western cultures, where what it means to be a human is often quite different from the Western conception of the human. So this is the first thing that you would do if you're framing the question in sort of a posthumanist way is, well, what is the human? What does it mean to be humanist? And is it something that's natural, that's always there, always going to be there? We're that thing? Or is it something that's mutable, that's changeable, that's historical, that's in some ways formed through knowledge and institutions and power and history? And can it change, right? Does it change? And so for a posthumanist, it can change, and it has changed. So a posthumanist will say that throughout history, the human has been defined in opposition to the non-human, and especially to the non-human animal, all right? All these things are now starting to break down. The defining line between human and non-human animal, as we saw in our first lecture in ethology, is something that's become permeable, it's starting to break down. And so the history of humanism, the humanist history of the human as a discrete thing, outside of nature, outside of animality, is something that doesn't really work all that well anymore. And so if you're thinking in those terms, you're thinking in a post-humanist way. And so what is humanism, right? We should know this. Humanism it's a broad category. It's something that you could go back all the way to the Greeks, this idea of humanism. And then you have an echo with the Greeks up to the Renaissance, where you have Renaissance humanism. But most of the time, when people talk about humanism today, they talk about an ethical philosophy that determines right or wrong by appeal to universal human qualities. And usually like rationality, our ability to reason. We're smart creatures. That's what humanism is. Humanism now has become a secular position. So this is divorced from, let's say, the idea of the human as a God-given thing, or man as made in the image of God, right? That would be a non-secular, more divine explanation of the human. So we leave that to the side. Humanism, as a 20th century contemporary concept, is an ethical philosophy that tries to appeal to universal human qualities. So I think you see now, if we already question what humanism is or what the human is, that some problems will come into this, right? In focusing on the capacity for self-determination, humanism rejects the validity of transcendental justifications. So no dependence on belief without reason, no dependence on the supernatural, no dependence on the divine origin, like I was saying before. The human in humanism is something that is founded just on human reason alone, right? No calls to transcendental, which means like metaphysical, godly, divine sense of grounding of what humanism is, or what the human is. But what if the human in humanism is itself a dogma? This is the key aspect here, because I think you can probably tell that the way we're describing humanism, it's slightly circular. Humanism defines the human as the rational, universal being, right? It's a self-definition, and it's quite Western. So it's possible that the human itself in humanism is a dogma. And by dogma, I mean it's a belief, an ungrounded belief, right? That the human is this rational being that can define himself, and that can define humanism. So this gets tricky, right? And so this is where we get to a really important insight in Wolff's text about humanism and the Enlightenment. And it's often thought that, in some ways, humanism and the Enlightenment are more or less the same thing, or that they're fellow travelers. But that might not actually be the case. So it's useful to recall Foucault in his essay. You can tell Foucault's a big name for Wolff in this text, at least in this introduction. Foucault wrote a text called "What is Enlightenment" in 1984. And there he cautioned us. He said we shouldn't confuse humanism and the Enlightenment as the same thing, all right? Even though they are fellow travelers in history. So Enlightenment is a process. It's a very, very long history, but it's a process basically not unlike humanism in some ways, of submitting everything to critique, to rational critique. The big modus operandi in the Enlightenment was to critique all dogma, to critique belief in God, to critique belief in kings, to critique all sorts of beliefs. Basically, enlightenment is about critique. You want to question everything, right? And so what happens if the Enlightenment critiques humanism? What happens if the Enlightenment doesn't only critique divine rule, God, kings, and so on and so forth? What if it also questions the human in humanism, right? If it does, it'll show that actually the concept of the human will itself be borrowed from religious, scientific, and political history. That human will be its own dogma, right? And maybe the fundamental dogma, at least in the West, since the human is so often defined as transcendent and distinct from animality, right? So there's someone like Bruno Latour. I will use my cursor every once in a while to point things. Someone like Bruno Latour, who wrote a famous book called We've Never Been Modern, basically arguing that if to be modern entails leaving nature, where you have culture and nature and they're separate from each other, he says this has never happened. It's never happened, right? Then someone like Donna Haraway will say, we've never been human. Again, if we understand the human as distinct, transcendent from nature, transcendent from animality, Donna Haraway will say, well, we've never been human because we can't even think of what it would mean to transcend or not be animals or be creaturely in some way, especially post-Darwin, right? So this is where things get a little tricky and a little messy. The Enlightenment and humanism, it seems like they're fellow travelers until the Enlightenment turns on humanism and starts to critique the concept of human in humanism itself. And so if the human isn't distinct from the animal, then neither is culture distinct from nature, right? So the binary, the distinction between nature and culture start to break down here. And so when we're talking about posthumanist theories, we're also talking about post-natural theories. For the longest time in the history of humanism and in the Enlightenment, to be honest, human knowledge, culture, and technology was on one side, and then on the other side, separate from all that, is the natural history, natural processes, right? That completely collapses. That completely collapses. And so if we're talking about a post-natural state of affairs, we would say that human knowledge, culture, and technology are all part of nature, are all part of the great outdoors, and that nature itself can sometimes and is often a form of knowledge, a form of culture, or a form of technology, right? There are all sorts of non-human animals that use tools, that use forms of communication, that even use forms of teaching, that have their own culture in a certain way that's distinct from human culture and human knowledge and human technology, but nonetheless it can qualify as knowledge, culture, and technology. So when we're getting into posthumanism, things get quite tricky, but it's also exciting, right? It opens the door for all sorts of other different ways of thinking. And so Wolff's definition of posthumanism, and this is something a lot of people honed in on in their responses, and I think it was a little confusing, so hopefully I can try to make it a little more clear. He says his definition of posthumanism comes before and after humanism. And this seems counterintuitive because you'd think if something is called posthumanism that it can only come after, right? But that's not quite Wolff's point. So he says it comes before in the sense that it emphasizes the creaturely basis of human existence, or the finitude we share with other animals. By finitude, that means like we have bodies, we can die, we're vulnerable, we can be threatened, and we're actually dependent on a lot of different things, each other and the world outside, and so on and so forth. So it comes before. All these things that humanism erased, said that the human is not creaturely, it doesn't share in the finitude of other animals. Posthumanism will say, no, we have to recapture that. We have to recapture that sense, the sense of what it means to be a living entity on this planet before humanism. But then, of course, it also comes after humanism in the sense that not only does our creaturely existence sort of decenter us as discrete humans, but all the technology that we use, all the things that that sort of shape our minds and our bodies, also shape what it means to be human, right? So this is an important point. This is what Wolff means when he says things come, that his definition of posthumanism comes before and after humanism. So in short, a posthumanist world in Wolff's understanding is one where the human embraces both the evolutionary foundations of animality and its ongoing mutations via its own technologies. So the key thing to understand here is that his conception of posthumanism is different from transhumanism. Transhumanism, in the broadest sense, I think you can just describe as the idea that the human can be enhanced, either intellectually, physically, emotionally, and enhanced through prosthetics, through technology, through some sort of supplementation, right? And there's something kind of noble about transhumanism in the sense that it does want to eliminate disease, it does want to eliminate unnecessary suffering, it wants to extend human lifespan, so on and so forth, right? That's not Wolff's understanding of posthumanism. So transhumanists believe in the engineering of posthumans, of living beings that will no longer be human. They're going to be something that comes after humanism. And so transhumanism, unlike Wolff's posthumanism, thinks it can leave the evolutionary foundations of our animal bodies behind. So this is the big distinction. This is the really big distinction. Wolff doesn't believe that we can leave our bodies behind and enter into some other post-human state. So if you've seen, now we're just going to go through some examples. If you've seen Black Mirror, I love using some of these episodes. Some of them are actually quite brilliant. Maybe one of the best of the whole series of Black Mirror is series 3. The third series, episode 5, the one that's called San Junipero. So this is like the logical conclusion of transhumanism. I'm sorry, I'm spoiling the end here for people who haven't seen it. So maybe skip past this if you want the spoiler alert. But essentially, in this episode, people, of course, if they have the means, people can decide to basically download their minds into a system where they can basically live out the rest of their lives as Dada. And by live out the rest of their lives, it's arguably to infinity, as long as the robots maintain the system and everything keeps functioning, the planet doesn't collapse. As long as the database and the computer is still functioning, you're basically in there living as a digital being, right? Just pure mind, disembodied from any finitude of the body itself. So this arguably would be the dream of the transhumanist, leaving our bodies behind completely, leaving our finite creaturely bodies completely, and entering into a state of pure digital life, right? Where, unless you get I don't exactly know what it would mean to get sick or die in this digital life, but so it's a very interesting episode. It sort of shows you the logical conclusion of transhumanism. But we could go back and look at earlier art, earlier movements in art like Dada. There on the left, Raoul Hausmann, or Neusachlichkeit, New Objectivity, or Futurism. I don't show you an example of Futurism, but there are a number of movements in the earlier 20th century that started to show the human as supplemented by technology, as being extended by technology in certain ways. So for Raoul Hausmann, it's sort of making fun. This is Dada, so he's making fun of these newer technologies, which of course seem very old to us, of the humanist supplemented by all these things. Or in Otto Dix, where you have these war veterans that are now handicapped, and they have all these different prostheses that sort of are extending their life and letting them, have jaws, have an ear. They're in some ways almost steampunk cyborgs already here in 1920. So there's something kind of transhumanist about this as well. And then once we get to works like Stella Lark, who's a French artist, who starts, this is in the 80s and 90s. Now we get to like full-fledged cyborg kind of material. So here's a work where he has a third arm that he can use. And it looks very clunky, very dumpy to us. But keep in mind, this is 1982. So this is like an extension of the human body. This is transhumanist in its own way. There's also his ear. In 2006, he inserted a new ear into his arm. So again, using the body almost like a machine, adding new senses. From what I've read, we'd have to look a little more into this, but from what I've read, like the ear, he can't hear from it, but he does sense certain things, which is pretty bizarre. So in both these instances, he's sort of destabilizing what it means to be human as a stable entity, right? It's like the human is almost a material, a piece of technology that can be tinkered with, right? And this really comes to a head in his Ping body from 1996. I'll show you a little bit of it. This is very early internet art, where he sort of, he looks ridiculous. It's kind of funny, but he's tied up to this machine that makes him move. Like the electronics make him move. He's not moving voluntarily, or only some of it is voluntarily. And it's coming from the internet. It's very early, 1996. But basically he had set up so remotely people could basically move him like a puppet. So I'll show you a little bit of it.
Hey, we've got something. This is the first time we've had it on. Is this a light on me? No. Can we put the light on me?
So that, it's a little, it's 1996, so it feels quite dated. But it's a good example, I suppose, of like a transhumanist type of work where the human body gets integrated into a network, into technology, in this instance, digital. But it might also show us the sort of dystopian aspects of transhumanism, because on the one hand, transhumanism is about, getting rid of disease, prolonging life, sort of leaving the precarity of our bodies. And yet, if we start to become too digitized, think of even living in a computer, then all of a sudden you have all sorts of thorny issues about human will in the way we've often understood it. Like our ability to make our own decisions, our ability to will our own lives, right? So if you're in a computer, then it's arguable that you're not completely autonomous, because there's always a possibility that there's some coder somewhere who's making you think, or approach life a certain way, right? So Stella Lark is kind of making this point in some ways, right? Here's a human body, a guy in 1996 whose movements are not his own, though it looks like they're his own. And there's a contemporary philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, who likes to talk about this quite a bit, about the intrusions of data, the intrusions of artificial intelligence, and the intrusions of technology on our bodies. We can already, when we're talking about mice in a lab, we can also already implant artificial memories, and we can also, in some ways, I mean, it's a bit gross, but they've already been able to take mice, wire their brains, and basically make them do things, almost like a remote control car that like a kid would have in the street, right? Where you can press a button and the mouse will go right. That's a little frightening, right? Because what if the mouse thinks he's gone right because he wanted to go right, but in fact there's an electronic impulse that was sent from outside of him that made him go right? So when we talk about transhumanism, it's all fine and good to talk about it as this, trying to prolong human life, but all these other philosophical complications come in when you ask about questions having to do with human will, our desires, and then just maybe the fact that we can't conceive of existence without dying, without getting old, without the wisdom of all those things, right? So again, you'd have to watch the San Junipero episode for those let's say more philosophical outcomes, more dystopian outcomes of transhumanism. That I wanted to also show you this ad. It's a Prada ad. So transhumanism itself can be, there's like a slick visual component to it that I think we can see in contemporary visual culture. So this ad could have been an ad that someone would do for their visual cultural analysis. So I'll just show it to you real quick.
We're glad you've made the decision to join us. You will follow our regime of health, movement, and speech therapy. In return, you will have access to information that will expand what you understand as reality. There will be no contact with outside parties. You will feel broken, each tear authenticated. I have something here for you to wear. Consider it a gift. Let's begin.
So kind of a crazy ad, one that definitely seems to be inspired by this sort of transhumanist sensibility of leaving our bodies behind, like almost becoming cyborgs, right? This is fashion for cyborgs, like a new type of flesh, one that seems like it would be more plastic than actual flesh in the way that we understand our bodies to have. So in class, I would have definitely, and if this wasn't sort of a makeup lecture, I would have you sort of write about this ad along the themes that we've been working with. I'm going to skip that for now, for time. We'll probably end up talking about Blade Runner at some other point. If you've never seen Blade Runner, you should definitely see Blade Runner. A lot of these themes run through that film. But then, of course, the other side of all this is posthumanism in Wolff's term, right, which is distinct from transhumanism. And one of the things posthumanism does is to one, argue that there's never been anything distinct. There's not some discrete human that's outside of culture, that's outside of nature, that's outside of animality. That in fact the human is a very special type of, very significant type of animal, but an animal nonetheless within evolutionary history. And so we can look at works where artists show us like an affinity between the animal body and the human body. And here's one by Kira O'Reilly, which is actually quite controversial when she did it. It was a performance with a dead pig. She was completely naked. The pig was dead, and she sort of posed and performed with this pig. And so there's some incredible things that happen here, because especially on the image on the right, the skin and the spine, there's a weird blending between human body and non-human body. They almost seem to have more in common than they have not in common, right? And there's also this relationship between a living body and a dead body. There's always the potential for the living body to be dead like the dead body, right? So this is a very visceral work, one that shows sort of the permeability between human life and non-human life, right? It's in very visual terms. She was criticized for that work, using a dead pig, and so the next work that she did was with a living pig. So she spent, I can't remember how many days, I think it was a number of days, with this pig in the gallery. They lived in the gallery together. And in this one, it was less about, let's say, physical affinities between human and non-human body, but it was more about mental affinities. And this one really, for me, it's much more, in some ways, much more fascinating. So the ambition of the work was that at some point they would both fall asleep together, and that they would both dream, right? That dreaming would be something that both the pig can do and the human can do. And that's really interesting. Like, what does it mean for a pig or a dog or a dolphin or a seagull or whatever it might be, when they're asleep? They dream like we do, like they have dreams. Dreams is a mental process that happens while we're in REM, while we're sleeping, right? So it's a really interesting work about blending the human and non-human capacity to dream. The other thing to note when we're talking about posthumanism, sorry, I just jumped the gun there, and that these two works sort of make, I think they do a nice job teasing out, is that for a posthumanist position, you would never say that the categories for what matter are those that the human have, right? So this is a problem, or it can be a problem, in the discourse of animal rights that we had a couple weeks back. So a lot of animal rights, like Singer or like Reagan, or like that non-human rights project that we talked about, the concept of right, just like the concept of human, is a historical concept. It's not some natural thing that we find. It's something that's formed through history, through culture, through institutions, through power. It seems to be almost always relative to human capacities, right? So the capacity to be autonomous, the capacity to have a certain level of cognitive capacity, of certain movements, to not be confined, all these things. The idea of human rights, and that maybe we should extend these rights to non-human animals. It always seems as if the measuring stick remains the human. This is why Wolff talks a lot about anthropocentrism and the idea that we should actually be against anthropocentrism. Because it's all fine and good with, let's say, a chimpanzee, or one of the other great apes, or maybe an elephant. These are animals with sophisticated cognitive capacities, brains very much like ours, and so we can sort of see ourselves in them. They sort of fit the bill of what human rights might be there for. But then there are all sorts of different forms of life, right? They're all forms of different forms of animals. So, like, think of octopus, think of cuttlefish, think of cetaceans, or think of this pig, right? what does it mean for these animals that are much more different from us than, let's say, chimpanzees? What does it mean for them to have a life? What does it mean? What is their world like, right? It might be quite different, right? So it might not fall under the scope of rights in the all too human sense of it, right? They might have a completely different conception of the world, or one that doesn't overlap with ours as much as, let's say, a closer primate, right? So a posthumanist would criticize discourse of animal rights, that it is anthropocentric, that its conception of rights is too based on the human, on human capacities, and that a posthumanist would say we actually have to consider the whole panoply of different forms of life on this planet, because it's teeming with all different forms of life, different forms of cognition, different forms of being in the world, right? That we can't reduce it to one set of rights that are human, all too human, that are too tied to sort of anthropocentric notions of rights. And so that's how I think a posthumanist would respond to these works. And so another work, Patricia Puccini, The Young Family, very creepy, but again, sort of giving us this hybrid, sort of crossing the boundaries between human and non-human. In this case, again, we're keeping the porcine, the examples from porcines, from pigs going. This seems to be a hybrid between a human and a pig. So she makes these really creepy sculptures. They're kind of fantastic. But it is in some ways grounded in recent science. So one of the first human-pig chimera, they've been created, and they're created, you might guess, they're created so that they can be harvested, not for food, but that their organs will be close. They'll basically be growing human organs inside their bodies that can then be used in medical procedures for humans that need it. And so the very idea that a non-human body can retrofit a human body and it would sync up, it would work, already tells you something, that the human is not something separate from the animal world, right? And they've been using pig hearts for quite some time, far before this study. And then I can also show you a work by Pierre Huyghe. This is a really wonderful work. Unfortunately, I don't have the video itself. The gallery, I've asked the gallery to send me the video to be able to show it to my students, but they're not really forthcoming. So maybe one day you can see this video in a gallery where I've seen it. It's really quite good. For now, I just have the still. It's by Pierre Huyghe. He's a French artist, known beginning in the 1990s in relational aesthetics. He's done a lot of interesting work since. This is called Human Mask. It's a video of a monkey. Her name is Fuku-chan. She works in a restaurant in Tokyo. And Pierre Huyghe saw a film online of her that I'm going to show you in a second, because that I do have, that inspired him to do this work. And so she's alone in the restaurant, but after hours there's no one else there other than Huyghe and his film crew. And she wears this mask, which is based off of Noe Theater in Japan. And there's this really, really beautiful thing that starts to happen in these scenes. It's also slightly creepy, but it's also quite wonderful at the same time. It can be both, I think. She really feels like a cross between, let's say, a little human girl and a primate, right? Or a monkey, a macaw, right? There's this incredible blurring the boundaries here, which is also, let's say, posthumanist in the way we've been talking about it. And the video, the work itself, is very different from what I'm about to show you. This feels much more exploitive, much more creepy. The video is not like that, although it could be exploitive in its own way, right? But I did want to show you Fuku-chan, because she's an actual living macaw who really does work in this restaurant in Tokyo. So she becomes the actor in Huyghe's film. And to even talk about animals as actors in some ways is a posthumanist way of describing the task of acting. So let me just show you very quickly her. This is the YouTube clip that inspired Huig. Okay, so it goes on for quite some time. I won't show you the whole thing. If you want to see the whole thing, just Google it, Fuku-chan, Human Mask, YouTube. This is still up on YouTube, but it's a nice video where, I mean, let's say a humanist conception of this would be to say there are humans here who are enjoying their meals, and then there's this sort of robotic animal, almost in like the Cartesian sense, that sort of just like the furniture goes around, basically like an appliance, right? That goes around, serve towels, and she'll go and get beer. Or if in this history, in this conception, it would be it, right? It would go get a beer for the customer. So you have human culture eating food table, and then you have pure nature, mechanical nature, this monkey that's excluded from that world, right? That would be the humanist conception of this. But I think to our eyes, like we can already sort of tell that doesn't quite work, right? It does feel like Fuku-chan, the macaw, seems to be part of the social situation, seems to understand the desires that these customers have, seems to have a certain amount of ability to use fridges, to hand out towels, to open beers, right? So there's a weird way in which this division between culture and nature gets completely broken down in the shape of this macaw, right? Just the fact that the macaw that lives and works in this restaurant. This is now much more of a post-humanist conception. And we want to be careful. We wouldn't want to say, oh, this is just like a little girl, a little human girl who's helping out at the restaurant, right? No, this is a distinct creature. This is a distinct form of life. And I think we can say certain things about what it might be like to live and work there, but then there are other things I think that are going to be more or less inaccessible to us, right? Because this is not a human child. This is a non-human macaw, right? But it doesn't mean that it's completely separate from the human world, at least for a post-humanist conception of life, right? So I think that's good. I think we'll leave it there. I hope this all was interesting. Hope it all made sense. I hope this made the reading a little bit richer, a little bit more clear, less opaque than it was. Next week we'll talk about bioart. It'll be probably a fuller lecture, although maybe not much longer. I actually think I went quite a ways on this, just impromptu. But it'll be a little longer, and you will have asides and questions I ask you, and just moments for further reflection in the next lecture. That then I will count attendance. For this lecture is just for those who wanted to catch up on the posthumanism lecture that we had missed. It's a chance for me to try out this new remote format, just me and my computer here. It seemed to go okay, but I'm sure it'll get better as we go. So until next week, take care, everybody.